Good afternoon, everyone. We've got quite a sort of large topic to try and cover between now and cocktails. So it's 35 minutes. I'm going to try and take up as little time as possible, but I thought I would try and at least set the scene on what is, as I say, a very big topic. Oh, there we go. All right. So what I'm going to do is start off looking at the very short term, then look at the longer term from an energy transition perspective, and then sort of just do a little bit of focusing in on the shipping markets and the energy transition that we're seeing in shipping. So to start off with, I've put up something of a classic slide of MSI's, where are we on the earnings cycle. And what I want to just take home from this slide, the one thing I want to take home from this slide, is that the energy sectors are doing relatively well to all other sectors of shipping. We can see the oil tankers, the LPG, LNG carriers have just come off recent highs. We can see the offshore markets sort of climbing the foothills of the next earnings peak. What we've also seen is, from an oil consumption perspective, we've seen a jump up in oil consumption. Some of that has been driven by the COVID bounce, but also just generally, there's been more consumption of oil over the last couple of years. So we're back to sort of pre-pandemic levels. With that, we've also seen an uptick in the oil price. So the oil price now is sort of comfortably sitting at the sort of $80 plus a barrel. That, of course, is impacting what we're seeing in the investment within the oil industry, the oil and gas industry. And we can see on the chart on the right, offshore oil and gas EPC contract awarded. We can see a big bounce in 2021 and in 2022, and we're already seeing some developments in 2023. So a lot more investment in oil and gas than we had seen historically in recent years. But if we sort of start looking in the medium to longer term, and this is taken from MSI's energy model, we can see that hydrocarbons will eventually start tailing off in terms of fuel consumption by fuel type. We can see that electricity is starting to take a larger share, along with renewables. And transportation is responsible for around 60% of all oil consumption. And if we focus in on that a little, we can see that electricity, hydrogen, and renewables will start taking a larger share of the pie. And looking at shipping more specifically now, I think it's great that within the last few years we've started to see a serious uptake, certainly in some sectors, of alternative fuels and the fitting of dual fuel engines on a number of asset types. Most predominantly, we've seen this in container shipping and in car carriers. But as you can see with our chart on the right-hand side, we don't think it's going to stop there. We do expect to see more and more dual fuel engines being fitted across a broad spectrum of shipping, and the take-up and the fuel type will be very much dependent on the asset type and the asset size. Where is it trading and what is it trading? But finally, and this is my final slide, the one thing I would say is that utilizing green fuels from a purely economics perspective is still going to be a very difficult challenge for the markets. Green fuels are very expensive, I would say prohibitively expensive for some time to come. This chart just shows you the earnings premium for alternatively fueled vessels from MSI's economic analysis. And what we've simply done is just use a consensus for different fuel types over the course of the next sort of 25 plus years. We've assumed quite a healthy carbon price, around $300 per tonne. And based on the projections for fuel prices, we don't necessarily think we're going to see premiums being awarded to vessels running e-methanol, e-ammonia, e-LNG until the sort of second half of the next decade. Now, of course, that is going to be quite damning if we don't start seeing a transition towards dual fuel vessels across the whole fleet before then. So we do need to see a lot of ordering placed over the course of the next decade if the industry as a whole is going to meet sort of 2050 guidelines and targets. So that's where I'm going to end it, and what I'd like to do is just ask my panel members to come up and join me on stage, and we'll try and walk you through some of the developments that the panel expects to see going forward. So yeah, please do come up. Yeah, we can leave that one up. Oops, sorry guys. Sit where you are. Yeah, yeah. I might stand up, that might be easier. While I just grab a glass of water, what I'm going to ask to do is for each of the panelists, just very, very quickly, because we are short of time, just introduce themselves, their name, the company they work for, and their job title, and then we'll start running through some questions. So start for you, Arlie, if that's okay.
Thanks, Adam. I'm Arlie Sterling. I'm the president of Marsoft. Thank you. And I am Arlie Sterling, the president of Marsoft.
I'm Mike Watt, the director of a Center of Excellence in Singapore called iCARE with the Bureau Veritas, Marine and Offshore.
My name is Pernille Dahlgaard. I come from the Mc-Kinney Model Center for Zero Carbon Shipping. I'm responsible for business, regulatory, and analytics.
Hi, I'm Kheng. You might differ from what you see in the paper. Kingston caught COVID this morning, so I'm replacing him. I didn't know when I woke up this morning I'll be sitting here, so apologies for the color of my socks. But I basically cover decarbonization, maritime analysis and research for Standard Chartered.
And my name is Philipp Niesing. I represent MPC Container Ships, which is an owner of 60+ feeder container vessels. And I'm also in charge of the decarbonization efforts of the MPC group.
Brilliant, thank you. So as you can see, we've got a very diverse panel this afternoon, and hopefully we can extract some interesting insights out of everyone. And I guess, and it's good that we've got this slide as a precursor to my first question, because fundamentally, as I sort of alluded to, over the course of the last couple of years, we've seen something of a resurgence in the energy sectors, whether it be oil and gas, whether it be your oil tankers or gas carriers. So that has predominantly come through, say, the COVID bounce, but also the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And there's certainly a view that potentially this has put back the sort of decarbonisation of the global economy. So what I wanted to do was just start off and say, do we think that the events of the last 2 to 3 years have put back the decarbonisation of the global economy, or has it actually sped up? And I'm going to start off by asking Arlie for his views.
Thanks, Adam. I think it's fair to say that the energy industry has a long memory, and wars, pestilence, and famine don't really influence much the arc of that industry. Where I think there have been huge changes, and particularly in the United States, is in policy. And there's an enormous amount of money that's going to be devoted to decarbonization of the U.S. economy, as also, of course, Europe. And I think that will have an effect, probably over the next 10 years.
Okay, thank you, Arlie. And Pernille, have you, from your perspective, a European perspective, perhaps?
Well, I tend to agree with Arlie. I think the other good news around the earnings cycles is that it shows that there's a lot of money around there, which gives tremendous opportunities. So to a large extent, you could say there's a disconnect between the maritime and, in many contexts, the supply and the demand. There's a need for supply that's not there. It's not the money that's missing. So clearly, if we can convince the oil and gas industry to, say, transfer some of that money into all the opportunities that you have in renewable energy, that would be a fantastic opportunity. Okay.
Yep. No, I think that sort of leads very nicely into my next question, because I think as a global community, we certainly know that decarbonisation is needed, and we sort of know the path that we need to walk down to get there, but we're not perhaps getting there quick enough. So, Mike, I was going to pose to you that sort of what is the barrier, and why aren't we getting there quicker?
I think if you look at it, the technology is definitely there, and in Bureau Veritas we're being approached by many stakeholders who have the different technologies. So whether that be engines or fuel cells, these things exist. So the barriers that I can see is really the lack of infrastructure, and a fragmented one as well, where different parts of the world are concentrating on different areas, right? So some people are looking at the infrastructure of methanol bunkering, and others are looking at the infrastructure of ammonia bunkering for vessels, right? On top of that, another barrier I would say is that regulations are not particularly clear at the moment, and they're still evolving. In Europe, they've got one way of looking at it, and then IMO has a global view of that as well, you know. And one other area I'd say as well is that, is there a business case for it? You know, does the business case exist to actually say, oh yeah, I'm going to decarbonize? What is the real push for people to do it? And if there isn't that push, then that ends up being a complete barrier as to why the energy transition should happen. So until there's something that actually inflicts on business where they say, I have to do that, or makes it so there's significant profit for them to do so, then I don't see that we're going to see the change happen as quickly as we might like.
Okay, that's very interesting. And I think on that same carrying on the theme, as we saw from the charts that I put up, hydrocarbons will play a significant part of the energy consumption to 2050 and beyond. But what we're seeing, and this is to you, CC, what we're seeing is a lot of the banks are pulling out of financing the production facilities, infrastructure involved in oil, gas, coal. Do you have a view on this, and what's Standard Chartered's view, more importantly?
Sure. Yes, let's focus on Standard Chartered's view. So maybe I'll start with the easy one first. Definitely for coal, for clients who are doing new coal projects or infrastructure, we will not be able to finance them. If a portion of their revenue falls under thermal coal, again, we will not be able to finance them, and that number changes with time. So if you're a company today and 50% of your revenue is thermal coal, the threshold today is 80%. By the end of this decade, that threshold will fall to 5%. So naturally, we will see a reduction in exposure for coal. For oil and gas, it's definitely business as usual for us. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here at Marine Money Offshore. And I think one interesting aspect there is the usage of ESG labels in this sector. I think to try and put a very complicated subject simply, I think if there's a carbon project that emits 10 units, and if there exists a technology to bring it down to 0 units, that should be green. And if there's technology to bring you somewhere along the curve, that should be transition. So Standard Chartered, late last year, we did a transition finance facility for an FPSO. So it's very much business as usual in the financing space, and possibly still attaching transition labels, although I'll add the caveat that that was 6 months ago, and it's a constantly evolving space, and there's a huge checklist and framework for that. So yeah, hopefully that provides some context.
Yep. Thank you, CC. And I think if we start focusing a little bit more on maritime now, I think maritime has been identified as a hard-to-abate industry. I think along with 6 others, including things like cement, steel production, petrochemicals, all users of shipping potentially, and of course there's things like airlines, aviation as well. But we're all faced with the same problem in these hard-to-abate sectors, and I personally think there perhaps isn't enough collaboration between the industries, but perhaps I'm coming at it from too much of a shipping hat on. So I was going to put the question to Pernille, whether you've got any more insight, whether there's any broader discussions going on between industries to help all industries get to the same final goal by 2050?
It's absolutely a super relevant question. I think, as you say, maritime in itself is a very difficult to abate industry. So what we focus on in the center is collaboration within the maritime industry, which in itself is a pretty big undertaking. So we're trying to drive the entire maritime ecosystem towards net zero in 2050. it is correct that if you're looking at where do you use your green energy in the best way, where you abate most CO2, well, maritime falls pretty far down on that curve, unfortunately. So I think coming maybe a little bit back to my point before, that there's going to be an enormous demand for green fuel. Hence, we need enormous investments into the supply sector. And if there's enough of it, or if the maritime sector is willing to pay for it, and that can be done with regulation, or it can be done in other ways, it will solve itself. I think you're right that there's a need for a cross-industrial collaboration. I'm not aware of much going on there, but I think where we can focus as an industry is very much on pushing for the general supply.
Okay, thank you. And Mike, I mean, does BV, given BV does cover a large number of industry, do you have any further insights into my question?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the moment we are starting to see like quite a bit of collaboration. I'd say, so I joined the center at the beginning of this year. BV is like a massive testing, inspection, certification company, 83,000 employees. So we cover every single part of the industry pretty much. And what we're starting to see is that marine cannot do this in isolation, right? And so in BV, we're starting to see things coming in from our industrial side into marine, and stuff going out from marine into industrial. And what we're having to do is to collaborate internally with inside BV, which is in a way quite a fragmented organization because there's so many entities there. And we're having to join up the dots and go, okay, so these guys who've got no idea about marine are now having to understand what actually makes marine tick. And marine is having to understand further up the value chain as well. And that kind of ties in as well with, as the regulations start to change, there's going to have to be that collaboration, because as we start to look at fuels in a very different way, and we start to look at them from LCA, which is the life cycle assessment, right? Where we look and see actually what is the true carbon emission of that fuel. That's where the difference is going to be, and that's where everybody further up the line, upstream, downstream, midstream, is going to have to really play a part and be quite transparent as well about what's going into how fuels are made, how they're transported, looking at it from what we call the well to the wake, you know, from production all the way through to the point where it gets utilized on board the vessel, whether that's burnt or through a chemical transition.
Thank you. No, and I mean, I don't want to get too negative on shipping, because I think a lot has been done in the last 3 years in terms of decarbonisation and the industry recognising the challenge ahead. I mean, I started looking at sort of decarbonisation in shipping. My first project was in 2010, and I think more strides have been made in the last 3 years than they had in the 10 years previous to that. So, Philipp, I mean, have you got any views of why in the last 3 years we've seen this rapid uptick in sort of the realisation, and actually people putting their hands, literally putting their hands in the pocket as per MPC, buying dual fuel vessels, fitting new technologies to vessels? Why in the last 3 years? Where's the pressure come from?
Well, the pressure is obviously regulation and also availability of technology. That's what changed over the last 3 years. And I got a very nice example for the cooperation which Mike just mentioned. Our two methanol feeders which are on order were actually a cooperation between a liner company, their biggest shipper, and ourselves. So we aim to build a green corridor up the west coast of Norway, and that was, I think, a very new way of working together between the different parties. But certainly, I mean, main driver is regulation with EEXI and CII. Suddenly, assets which are not performing well under emission perspective are about to be penalized. I mean, there's no penalty yet, but that's going to come. So every ship owner actually has to figure out how to keep his own assets in the market. And then I think there's also a broad understanding that the IMO trajectory is not sufficient enough to actually decarbonize fast enough to stay under the 1.5 degrees warming barrier. And then last not least, the European Emission Trading Scheme makes everyone very excited, and maybe we have a chance to talk about this at a later stage as well. And then there's also the technologies. I mean, methanol engines are now available, so you can order methanol vessels. Ours will be delivered within next year. And also, ammonia will probably be available as of 2026, positively thinking. So, yeah, I think that's...
Thank you. How about you, Arlie? You must have been looking at decarbonisation as long as I have in the shipping markets. What do you think has been the sort of catalyst that sort of caused the industry to sit up and take note in the last 3 years?
Luckily, Adam, I think there's a simple answer to that. The most significant change in the industry that's driven decarbonization is EEDI and the development of eco-ships. The ships that began to be delivered in 2015 were 20 to 30% less fuel, had lower fuel consumption than ones that were built before that time. So that there was a mixed blessing. I think some of those first generation eco-ships weren't great in many ways, but that path has been set by the regulation, and I think it's had some impact. In the last 3 years, probably the increase in the price of LNG has had the most significant impact.
Yep. Okay. How about CC from your perspective, from a banking perspective? How are you seeing that sort of acceleration in the last sort of 3 years? I'm using 3 years as I mean, it's 2, 3, 4 years generally.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the amount of sustainability-linked products we're doing, transition finance, we've signed up to Poseidon Principles in April 2021. We've got ourselves on the steering committee of that last year as well, so I think that's going to provide a lot more impetus. And whilst our clients are all not yet at methanol fuel ships, I think it provides a standard and for December 2022, when we reported our figures for the preceding year, I think it's a bit unfair to look at those figures yet. But I think come December 2024, when our owners report on 2023 sailings, when CII, EXI has all kicked in, I think that will be a much better time to look at how to ensure that our portfolio basically streamlines, and hopefully that provides a boost to the sector as well in terms of decarbonization.
Yeah, you sort of bring up the Poseidon Principles, and that sort of leads quite nicely into my next question, because so from where I'm looking at the industry, there seems to be something of a bifurcation going on, that you have your sort of your top tier A1 listed, have ESG credentials, are pushing forward and doing a lot, and then you have another group, and perhaps this is a longer tail, whereby the owners are perhaps just doing the bare minimum. Do you think that we're going to see the sort of bifurcation with the Poseidon Principles, just with finance, with insurance, sea cargo, charter, etc.? Will we see this continued sort of bifurcation?
I think two-tier is oversimplifying it. I guess if you look at the earnings market, you've got EEDI and eco vessels, then you've got scrubber, then you've got dual fuel, LNG, you're going to get dual fuel methanol, and that's going to create a 5-6 tier market. So I think in terms of how that filters through to finance as well, I don't think it's going to be as simple as a two-tier market. That being said, I think looking at the strength of Poseidon today, there's 30 signatories. It accounts for 2/3 of the global ship finance. I think as more banks sign up, that number's only going to increase. And if you look to 2030, when targets become a bit more strict, and I guess when 2030 interim targets kick in, a lot of banks, including ourselves, we've declared that to be net zero, we need to have 0% alignment delta. Even banks that are not in Poseidon, like DBS, they've also announced that they need to get there. So I think in 2029, if you have a 13-year-old ship that runs on VLSFO and you're trying to get financing, probably it's going to be very difficult, or the bank that's going to offer it to you has to charge a very high pricing because you're going to bring up his alignment delta quite severely. So I think at that stage you could see it, but in the next 1 or 2 years, I think not yet.
Yeah, understood. I mean, we've talked a lot about fuels, and I think the industry has become, you can't go to a conference, you can't even read an article in the trade press without someone talking about fuels, alternative fuels, whether that's methanol, ammonia, etc., etc. But there's still a lot of sort of operational gains and sort of lower emission technologies that can be fitted on vessels. And what I wanted to ask the panel is, Do we think we've picked all the low-hanging fruit in that regard, or is there a lot more that could be done from these operational changes or lower emission technology installations? Philipp, I know MPC have installed some new technologies on board some of your vessels. Is there more to be done?
Actually, the CII is a nice accelerator. I mean, with all its shortcomings, what it does, it supports a very different discussion with the charterers. And what we've been able now to agree with one of our biggest clients, or with our biggest client, is a joint retrofit program on 10 of our vessels. So we are installing several energy-enhancing technologies like variable frequency drive pumps and waste heat recovery for auxiliary engines and so on. And we split the costs, actually. And these sorts of deals, we've been trying over the last 2-3 years, actually, because, I mean, the charterer is harvesting the fuel savings, and we have the investment, so that's the split incentive problem we have in the shipping industry. And the CII certainly has helped overcoming that, at least in this example, but there are more of those. I mean, yeah.
How about you, Arlie? You think this, because I know you've been very involved with carbon credits, is there an uptake with owners wanting to do more in terms of new technologies on board vessels and retrofitting?
So if you think back to the comment earlier about the sea change in the fleet around 2015, when we started seeing a new generation of eco vessels come into the fleet. Right now, about half the fleet is built before 2015. So you've got somewhere on the order of 30,000 vessels that can be retrofitted to mitigate or to reduce the difference in efficiency. And yes, we're seeing a lot of interest in that. Carbon credits are a way to fund that in a fashion that also provides a clear labeling and auditing of the benefits. So I think there's a growth in the retrofit industry generally, a growth in finance for it, and innovative financial instruments. And it'll make a big difference towards the overall fuel consumption of the fleet.
And Mike, from a BV perspective, are you still seeing a lot of interest in sort of retrofitting new technologies on board vessels?
Absolutely. It's, you know what, it's so busy right now. I'm having to expand my team because we just between the team that we've got, there's not enough time in the day to deal with every single inquiry that's coming.
What's popular? What's popular? What's not?
Okay. So we're seeing quite a bit of people interested in carbon capture and storage. Also, BV's had quite a few AIPs as well in the area of hydrogen fuel cells. Also AIPs with wind propulsion. Strangely enough, yes, sail is giving way to steam. No, it's interesting. Like, there's a lot, and there's a lot of things coming through. So yes, we're looking at fuel cells, and there's some big companies who are going, I want to try this. I want to try and see if I can change my auxiliary engine and put a fuel cell instead, right? We want to see if there's another way that we can use maybe something like methanol as a carrier for hydrogen, right? So an alternative way of transporting, of using hydrogen, but using it as methanol, right? So all these things are happening. It's getting very, very busy, and yes, I would say that a lot of it's coming from the big boys, the people with money, and who are looking to see how they can develop and get a head start above, or be an early starter and get in front of everybody else, you know. So yeah, we're seeing a lot. It's very, very interesting.
Okay, thank you. I mean, not to go back on what I just said, but I do just want to talk a little bit about fuels, because I think in the long run, to get to sort of zero or net zero emissions by 2050, there will have to be a change in fuels. And as Philipp, as you already said, MPC has recently contracted last year some dual fuel methanol vessels. So I was just going to ask, why methanol? Did ammonia ever come onto the drawing board, or LNG, or was it methanol from the get-go?
Well, actually, we are fuel agnostic. I think that's the the buzzword for that, right? So such projects are developed jointly with our customers and even with their customers, and that's how we ended up with methanol. But also, I mean, the engines were available, and we see a good chance to source green methanol in the area the vessel is going to operate. But we've also been discussing ammonia projects, obviously a bit far out than this very project. And we also invested in a company producing synthetic marine diesel. So this is a startup.
Okay.
And so we are agnostic there, and we do what our customers actually want.
And I think that agnostic may come when I ask CC now, does Standard Chartered have a view on fuels? If I came to you with I'm trying to think of a sector that you'd probably like to invest in, well, I'll just say a Cape-sized bulk carrier, ammonia, methanol, dual fuel, and LNG dual fuel, would you
I think it's
have a view?
Yes, I think I would have a view, and I think it's important for financiers to not just wait for the owners to come in with the solution. We need to get up the knowledge curve and understand what each implication is. And this is especially enhanced now that we're in Poseidon as well. So I think Mike talked about LCAs. Right now, the IMO reports on tank to wake, but eventually it could move to well to wake, and we need to know what the impact is for each alternate fuel on what that impact is. And the moment that change does happen, we need to be there with our clients to understand and be there to work with the solution. What is the way forward? So yes, for Capesize, we would have a view. I think we're agnostic as well. And earlier in your chart, you showed VLCC. It's going to be in 2030, 2040. It's going to be dual fuel ammonia and dual fuel methanol. So we shouldn't pick one or the other. Why not finance all VLCCs that implement either alternative fuel?
Thank you, CC. Pernille, one of the metaphors that we hear a lot, and it's overused, and apologies for me using it again, is the chicken in the egg. In terms of the technologies
Is the chicken in the egg?
Well, oh, wow. That's a philosophical question in itself. But what we constantly hear is that the landside infrastructure, the availability of the fuel is not available, and therefore ship owners don't want to go out and order dual-fueled vessels where the capex is more expensive because they can't depend on the fuels, the availability, etc., etc. Of course, we're starting to see green corridors come into the equation. Do you think we're starting to put the chicken before the egg, or the egg before the chicken, or do you think that the solution is on the horizon?
With the egg and the chicken, I recently learned that it was the egg that came first. So just to get that one out. I think absolutely because we're talking about so heavy investments, so huge capex commitments from all parties in the industry, there's indeed an inherent dependency, and there's a bit of a wait and see. You say one of the reasons that we have been put as a sender into place is exactly to try to get those parties together and say, how do we solve this? Because otherwise, I'll not move before you move. And then we'll all stand still for a very long time. And exactly as you mentioned, the green corridors is one initiative that we are taking together with many other good parties on trying to say, if we now, we can't decarbonize everything in one go. So if we make you could say, it's not even an experiment, but a controlled kind of area where we say, within this little area, we get the infrastructure in place, we get the vessels in place, we get everything in place, then we will learn a lot. So you could even see, you could almost see it as a kind of a pilot of a proof of concept to say, how do we then develop? And of course, our vision is that once we have a number of green corridors, they can all expand, because once Singapore has been involved as an example into a green corridor, you have say Singapore, Australia, it'll be much easier to make Singapore, Korea, and it'll be much easier to make Singapore, India, etc. So once it gets up and going, it will reasonably easily spread the wings.
Yep.
So I guess the short answer is yes.
Good, good, good. Philipp, you alluded to sort of my sort of penultimate question. I think one of the big news stories last week within the sort of decarbonisation space was the EU Parliament sort of brought shipping firmly into its emission trading scheme. Do you think that the industry is ready for that change, which will start sort of being drip fed to the industry next year?
Well, it's still 8 months to go, right? And that's shipping, so we wait until the very last moment before we really start solving that problem. No, but really, I mean, we've been trying to discuss over the last 1.5 years or so with our customers how we should set up the process. I mean, my hypothesis is that they're going to buy the certificates and then hand them over to us for us to surrender to be compliant. But actually, until just lately, none of our customers were even prepared to talk about it. So they were not willing to talk about it, and that is in absence of the final regulation. I think the financial effects will be significant. I mean, in the last stage, when 100% of emissions are to be covered, you can expect the fuel prices or the fuel bill to increase by 40% roughly. The one ton of CO2 costs 100 euros today. But that's the financial part of it, and I think we will be able to actually pass, or our customers will be able to pass that over to their clients, like a bunker adjustment factor. You will probably have an emission allowance adjustment factor or something like this. But what shipping doesn't seem to be very well prepared for is the administrative burden which comes with it, and that's going to be really tremendous. I mean, there are so many stakeholders, and there's so little preparation in that industry that I'm really a bit worried.
Yeah, no, I would agree. The paperwork will always seems to get more. So this is my last question, if we've got time, Andrew. Okay, so I'm going to ask this question. We're going to go along the line. So the IMO is sort of coming under increasing pressure, sort of to move trajectories to a net zero position by 2050. My question is to the panelists: do you think this target is achievable? And what has to happen between now and then to make this goal achievable? Sort of one or two big things that have to happen, I guess, in the imminent future for 2050 net zero to be met. So I'll start with you, Arlie, and we'll move left as we go along.
Sorry, Adam, is the question, is the IMO going to set a...
No, I think the IMO will. I think they'll come under increasing pressure between now and X.
Okay.
But we need to think about getting to 2050 today. We you know, is it regulations? Is it cost? Is it market-based measures? Is it a more of a holistic thought process between industries?
Yeah, I by the way, I'll take a bet on the IMO's success in that regard.
I said X. I didn't say a specific date.
Look, I think the world that we all have to imagine is one in which we have essentially infinite supply of very, very low-cost electricity. That is the precursor to any kind of transition that's meaningful. I think that there are steps being made in that direction, but so far the technology does not exist and the ability to commercialize it does not exist. I'm skeptical that we'll be able to meet 2050.
Okay, so it's a technology challenge from your perspective.
Well, right. And if the technology existed, it would be too expensive. So.
Okay, big technology and costs. Mike?
Okay, so IMO is a global body, right? EU Fit for 55, okay, I can get like their ambitions for zero, but the big difference between Europe and the rest of the world is that there's a lot of developing nations, right? Now, how do they do zero? Many of them don't even have the kind of ability to move away from coal, you know. So it becomes a rich man's preference to have zero, right? Which seems very unfair to me. If they do it, then the only way they can do it is they'll have to have different tiers based on how poor your country is, I guess, you know. For me, I'm a big supporter of the nuclear technologies. And I think it will definitely play a large role in how we reduce emissions, whether that's production of new fuels, or whether that's providing electricity for those developing countries, and for the electric boats and harbour craft that Singapore is trying to get into right now.
So I do believe that IMO will go to net zero, or argue for net zero in 2050. And our analysis shows that with the known existing technology, it is possible. It's not going to be easy, but it is possible. It requires a lot of regulation. It requires a lot of recirculation of money. Exactly what you say, the just and equitable transition is really key, and that's going to be difficult. But yes, it is possible. Market-based measures and regulation.
I think one statistic I want to bring out here is we worked with a consultant last year, and to move to hit net zero by 2050, the industry needs $2 trillion. 25% of this money, 500 billion, is going to be needed to be spent by ship owners, retrofitting, ordering new ships. The remaining 1.5 trillion is for the world's ports to come up with bunkering infrastructure to cater to ammonia and methanol. So I guess the ship owner's point of view, and it's the chicken or egg question again, why am I going to put an ammonia ship if there's not going to be ammonia bunkering? So I think really the regulators need to create an environment for ports and bunkering terminals out there to say net zero is going to happen if you spend 500 billion upgrading your 1.5 trillion upgrading your facilities. Owners will spend 500 billions to buy your fuel. So I think yes, long-winded way of saying yes, I think it can happen, and I think regulation needs to be firm and take the first step there. And I can't wait for July MEPC ATE to see how that swings.
Yes, my answer would be yes, but it will certainly need regulation, and it will also need the willingness to pay from the customer side. So I mean, they need to accept premiums on the cargo carried, and we need smart instruments like a global book and claim system and things like this. But yes, I think it is possible, but a long way to go still.
I'm glad I'm in the minority.
Okay, I think that was a very insightful panel, and I'd like to just thank my panelists and for everyone's time for listening. Thank you.